I was there that night, when the earth itself seemed to tremble with fear. Okonkwo's face, usually so stern and proud, twisted with a look I had never seen before. The night he fell was the night we all knew the spirits had come. It started with a whisper, low and soft, like the wind through the palm trees. We didn't think much of it, not at first. But as the days passed, something strange began to happen in our village. The yam harvest, which should have been plentiful, was ruined by pests that no one had seen before. The goats began to die, and the children started waking up with strange fevers. It was as though the world was unbalancing itself. Okonkwo had been a strong man. He had always held his ground, even when his father's death weighed him down, even when the tribe looked down on him. But now, something was different. The proud warrior seemed unsettled, his face always tight with a worry he couldn't shake. He stopped coming to the village meetings. The laughter from his compound was quieter, replaced by silence, as if the spirits had taken the joy from him. I still remember the night the elders gathered. The fire in the center of the village burned bright, casting shadows on the walls of our homes. Okonkwo sat at the front, his gaze far away, his shoulders hunched, as though he carried the weight of the entire world on them. The village chief spoke of the strange happenings, the disease in the crops, the spirits who had been angered, and how they were restless in the forest. We must listen to the gods, or they will punish us all, he said. His voice was heavy, full of the knowledge only age could bring. I watched Okonkwo's hands curl into fists. It was clear he didn't believe in the spirits, not truly. He had always been a man of action, a man who believed in the strength of his own arms and mind, not the unseen forces of the world. But that night, there was something different in his eyes, a flicker of fear. And that was when I knew, deep in my gut, that this was not something that could be fixed with a fight. 2 days later, the sun disappeared behind a thick cloud, and a storm unlike any we had ever seen rolled over the village. It was not the kind of storm that brought rain, but one that brought chaos. The winds howled like spirits of the dead, and the trees bent as if trying to escape from something terrible. The villagers took shelter in their huts, praying to the gods they had long ago forgotten. It was during this storm that Okonkwo disappeared. When he returned, hours later, soaked to the bone and trembling, something had changed in him. His eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen. He didn't speak to anyone, he just stumbled back into his compound and locked the door. We tried to reach him, to ask what had happened, but he wouldn't open up. The next day, his wife told us a strange story. Okonkwo had wandered into the forest during the storm, muttering about how he needed to speak to the gods. They said he had knelt by the sacred river and prayed for hours, calling on every spirit he had ever heard of, promising to sacrifice anything the gods wanted. What happened next, no one could explain. But after that night, Okonkwo changed. He stopped eating. He refused to speak. It was as though the spirit world had claimed him, and the man who had been so strong, so proud, was now broken, lost in a world where the boundaries between the living and the dead were no longer clear. The villagers spoke of it in whispers. Some believed Okonkwo had been chosen by the gods, and that he had to be left alone to fulfill a task none of us could understand. Others said he was cursed, and that the spirits would claim him as they had claimed his father before him. But I knew, deep down, that Okonkwo's fall had begun that night in the forest. The spirit had come for him, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. After the storm, the village seemed to breathe a little easier, but there was an uneasy stillness in the air. The crops had not been saved, the goats still lay dead in the pens, and the children continued to fall ill. The elders knew something was wrong, but no one dared to speak the truth. Okonkwo had been chosen, and his fate had already been sealed by forces beyond our understanding. For a week after the storm, Okonkwo refused to leave his compound. His wives, the same ones who had cared for him through countless battles and hardships, had become his caretakers now, but they were as lost as the rest of us. They would bring him food, but he wouldn't touch it. He would sit, staring at the walls of his hut, his eyes glazed, his hands shaking. The fierce warrior who had once defeated his enemies without mercy had become a shell of himself. One morning, I went to Okonkwo's hut to see if he would speak to me. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear the soft murmur of his voice. It wasn't the kind of voice I had heard before, strong and commanding, but weak and full of uncertainty. "Okonkwo," I called softly, stepping into the dimly lit hut. He looked up, but there was no recognition in his eyes. They were distant, as though his mind was no longer in the hut with me but somewhere far away, in a place where the living couldn't follow. "Do you remember me?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of worry and confusion. He blinked, but it took a long time before his lips parted, as though the words were too heavy to speak. The gods have claimed me," he said quietly, almost as if to himself. "I tried to fight them. I thought I could bend them to my will, like I bent my enemies. But they are stronger than I am. They know my weakness. They know my heart." I could feel the weight of his words press against me. The man who had once feared no one was now trembling with fear, a fear not of men, but of the very gods he had once scoffed at. "They told me," Okonkwo continued, "that I must give something for my pride. The spirits, they want a sacrifice. They want to see that I am broken. They want to see my strength crumble." I didn't understand. I had always seen Okonkwo as invincible, as a man whose very name struck terror into the hearts of his enemies. Yet here he was, a broken man, humbled by forces that he had always denied. "But you are Okonkwo, the strongest man in the village," I said, trying to comfort him. "What are these gods compared to your strength?" He shook his head, and there was something in his gaze that sent a shiver down my spine. "Strength means nothing to them. The gods don't care about how strong you are. They care about how you live, how you honor them. I have dishonored them. I have dishonored everything, all for the sake of my pride." I wanted to speak, to tell him that he wasn't beyond saving, that he could still make things right. But I knew it wasn't that simple. Okonkwo had always believed that his actions could shape his destiny, that through sheer will he could force the world to bend to his desires. But now, the world had turned against him, and the more he fought, the more he sank into the depths of his own despair. As the days passed, Okonkwo's condition worsened. His strength, which had once been the foundation of his reputation, was now gone. He became a shadow of his former self, barely able to stand, and his eyes never seemed to focus on anything. His wives tried to care for him, but it was as though the very life had been drained from him. It was during this time that the village began to speak of the prophecy that had been told many years ago before Okonkwo had risen to power. The elders spoke of how the gods had warned that the village would face great turmoil, and that a man who had once risen to great heights would be brought low. Some said it was a curse, others whispered that it was fate. I remember one evening, as the village sat around the fire, the eldest of the elders, his voice as ancient as the trees, spoke to us. "The spirits have chosen Okonkwo," he said, his eyes clouded with age. "They have come to remind us that no man, no matter how strong, is beyond the reach of the gods. It is not the strong who rule, but those who understand the balance between the living and the unseen." The villagers listened in silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the dark. I felt a chill run through me as the elder spoke of the sacrifice that Okonkwo would have to make, a sacrifice that would either save the village or destroy it forever. One day, as the village gathered to discuss the next steps, word came that Okonkwo had vanished again. This time, no one knew where he had gone. His wife said they had heard him talking in his sleep, muttering about the river, about sacrifices, and about the spirits. Days passed without word from him, and the village grew anxious. Some believed he had gone to the river to seek redemption, others thought that he had taken his own life in despair. But no one knew for sure. The villagers feared that Okonkwo, in his pride, had given too much of himself to the gods, and now they would claim him fully. And then, one morning, word came from the elders. Okonkwo had returned to the village, but he was not the same man. He was broken, yes, but in his eyes, there was a new kind of strength, one that had been forged not in battle, but in humility. He stood before the village, his hands raised, not in defiance, but in surrender. "I have learned," he said, his voice heavy, "that the gods cannot be fought. They cannot be defeated by strength alone. I have been foolish, and now I will make amends." The village watched in silence as Okonkwo knelt before the chief elder, offering a sacrifice, a symbol of his broken pride, a symbol of his willingness to accept the God's will. The spirits had come for Okonkwo, and they had taken what they wanted: his pride, his arrogance, and his unyielding strength. But in its place, they gave him something far more powerful: understanding. And with that understanding, the village began to heal, the crops began to grow once more, and the people knew that balance had been restored. Okonkwo was never the same again. He became a quiet man, one who no longer sought to prove his strength to the world. But in his quiet humility, he became a legend, a man who had fallen, only to rise again, not through power, but through the wisdom of the spirits. Despite Okonkwo's quiet return and the beginning of the village's recovery, things were never quite the same. The spirits had claimed him, and the events of that fateful night had left an indelible mark on the village, one that would not fade easily. The elders watched him closely, knowing that the weight of his sacrifice was heavy, far heavier than any warrior's battle wounds. The healing process for Okonkwo was not quick. He no longer held his head as high as he once did. His shoulders, which had once carried the weight of the world with pride, now slumped under the weight of something far more intangible: wisdom, perhaps, or perhaps just the burden of the things he had lost. Gone were the days when he stood tall among the village men, his word law, his pride a shield. Instead, he spent his days in quiet reflection, rarely speaking except when he was called upon by the elders. The villagers were divided in their feelings about Okonkwo's transformation. Some spoke of his newfound humility with reverence, seeing it as proof that even the greatest among them could learn the ways of the spirits. They whispered among themselves that Okonkwo had been touched by something greater than any man, something that had humbled him, forced him to look beyond his pride, and to see the world as it truly was. Others, however, were uncomfortable with the changes. They remembered the fierce Okonkwo, the man who had led them through wars and won the respect of all. To see him reduced to this shadow of himself was unsettling. They wondered if the spirits had broken him for good. A man like him, they said, does not simply change overnight. He will either break or be reborn. But Okonkwo's rebirth was slow, like a tree that had fallen in a storm and, over time, began to sprout new roots from the cracked earth. He was not the same, yet something in him had shifted. His pride, once so fierce, now lay in ashes at his feet. One evening, as the sun sank low and the fires began to burn brightly in the center of the village, Okonkwo stood before the elders. There was a quiet in the air, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Okonkwo had asked to speak, and no one refused him. His voice, when it came, was soft, almost as though he had forgotten how to speak with the strength he once commanded. "I am not the man I was before," Okonkwo began, his gaze never leaving the ground. "The gods took what they wanted from me, and in their taking, I have learned that I had been a fool. I thought that strength alone could make me invincible, but I see now that the spirits were always watching, waiting for me to understand." He paused, his hands clenched tightly at his sides, as though he was fighting to control the flood of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. "I was proud," he continued, his voice breaking, "too proud to listen, too proud to understand that there is more to life than victory. The gods have shown me my weakness. But I am not asking for pity. I only ask for forgiveness for myself, and for the village I have failed." The silence that followed his words was thick. The elders, who had seen many men come and go, who had witnessed countless sacrifices and struggles, looked at one another, their faces unreadable. They knew what Okonkwo had done for the village, and they knew the cost. The sacrifice he had made was not one that could easily be forgotten. Then, after a long moment, the eldest elder, the one who had spoken of prophecy before, rose from his seat. He walked slowly to where Okonkwo stood, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have learned," the elder said softly, "and in your learning, you have become something far greater than the man you once were. You were chosen by the gods, but it was not for your strength, Okonkwo. It was for your heart, the heart they knew would break and grow stronger because of it. You will never be the same, but that is not the curse it once seemed. That is the blessing." And with that, the villagers, who had gathered to listen, let out a collective sigh, as though they, too, had been waiting for Okonkwo to speak the truth of what had happened. They did not see him as broken anymore. They saw him as a man who had been remade, a man who had risen from the ashes of his pride like a phoenix, albeit one that would always bear the scars of the fire. As the seasons changed, so did the village. The crops began to grow again, the goats returned to the pasture, and the children who had once fallen ill were now running through the fields, laughing as they played. It was as though the village had entered a new era, one where respect for the unseen forces of nature and the gods was no longer an afterthought, but a way of life. And Okonkwo, the once mighty warrior, became the symbol of this new wisdom. He never sought to return to the way things were before. Instead, he dedicated himself to teaching the younger men of the village what he had learned. He spoke less of war and more of balance, the need for strength, but also the need for humility. He spoke of the gods, not as enemies to be fought, but as beings whose power could only be understood through respect. But the villagers never forgot Okonkwo's fall, nor did they ever take for granted the quiet wisdom that had replaced his former arrogance. When children were born, the elders would tell them stories of the mighty Okonkwo, the man who had once believed that no force was stronger than his own, until the gods showed him otherwise. They spoke of how he had learned that strength was not in fighting, but in understanding. And as Okonkwo grew older, his legacy shifted. He was no longer remembered solely for his triumphs in battle, but for his journey, a journey that had taken him to the very edge of destruction, only to bring him back as a wiser, humbler man. The village, in turn, became stronger. They understood that true power came not from the fight, but from knowing when to surrender. One evening, many years later, Okonkwo sat alone by the river that had once been a place of sacrifice, watching the water flow quietly by. The sun had set, leaving only the glow of the moon to light his path. He had learned much, but he still had a sense of peace that only time could bring. The spirits had taken his pride, but they had left him with something far more valuable, the peace of knowing that sometimes, to be truly strong, one must first learn to be still. As he gazed into the flowing water, Okonkwo whispered a silent prayer to the gods, not of fear or demand, but of gratitude for the lessons they had taught him, and for the strength he had found in the silence between the storms. As the years passed, Okonkwo's transformation became a part of the village's story. The elders who had once whispered of his pride now spoke of his humility, and the younger men who had admired him for his strength began to respect him for the wisdom he had gained through suffering. The village prospered in ways it had never known before. The yam harvests were good, the goats multiplied, and the river that had once brought him to his knees now seemed to flow with a gentle strength, as though it too had learned something from the old warrior. Okonkwo's legacy, however, was not just in the physical wealth the village accumulated. It was in the changes he brought about in the hearts of the people. The village no longer saw itself as a place ruled by pride, where strength was the only measure of a man's worth. They learned, through Okonkwo's fall and rise, that true power lay not in domination, but in balance. They began to worship the gods with more sincerity, understanding that the forces of nature were not to be challenged, but respected. As he grew older, Okonkwo's physical strength waned. His once powerful hands, which had wielded a machete with deadly precision, now trembled when he held anything. His shoulders, which had borne the weight of many victories, were hunched under the years of wisdom he had gained. Yet, there was a peace in him that was undeniable, a peace that came from the knowledge that he had accepted his place in the world. One afternoon, in the twilight of his life, Okonkwo sat with his family in the compound where he had once ruled with an iron fist. The children, now grown, had gathered to listen to his stories. His wives, no longer frightened of his temper, had become his companions, sharing in the quiet moments that had replaced the turmoil of his earlier days. The children listened intently, some with awe, others with curiosity, as he spoke. "Your father was a great warrior," Okonkwo said, his voice soft but steady. "But I was also a fool. I thought I could control everything. I thought my strength alone could protect me from the gods, from the forces of nature that we can never truly understand." The children looked at him, eyes wide with respect. They had heard the stories of his battles, his triumphs, and his rise from poverty to greatness, but they had never heard him speak so openly of his mistakes. "I was wrong," Okonkwo continued. "And when I learned that, when I understood that no one is invincible, not even the strongest warrior, the gods took my pride, and with it, they gave me something far more precious." He paused, looking out over the village, where the smoke from cooking fires rose into the evening sky. "They gave me peace. They gave me the strength to be humble. And now, I pass that wisdom on to you. Do not fear the spirits. Do not fear the unknown. But always respect it." The village had changed, and so had Okonkwo. The man who had once feared no one, not even the gods, was now a man who had learned to listen, to understand the world around him, and to accept his place within it. The fierce warrior who had once been blind to the balance of nature had now become a teacher, sharing his hard-won wisdom with the next generation. One morning, not long after his final lesson to the children, Okonkwo grew very ill. It came quickly, as though his body had decided that it had given all it could. His wives and children gathered around him, but he did not speak. He simply closed his eyes, as if he was at peace with whatever came next. The spirits had claimed him long ago, and now it seemed they were ready to take him completely. As the days passed, the village watched over him, but there was no struggle, no fight. The man who had once fought every battle with all the might of his soul now faced his final moment with quiet acceptance. The villagers knew that Okonkwo had finally understood what he had fought for all those years. He had fought for peace, for understanding, for balance. In his final moments, he had found it. The day Okonkwo passed, the entire village gathered to honor him. There was no grand ceremony, no loud mourning. Instead, there was a quiet reverence, as if the village itself was reflecting on the lessons he had taught them. They spoke not of his battles or his conquest, but of his journey, of the pride that had once consumed him, and the wisdom that had come when he laid it down. The children, who had grown up under his shadow, now took up his teachings and passed them on to their own children. The village continued to thrive, not because of Okonkwo's strength in battle, but because of his strength in humility. They learned that to be truly great was not to be unshakable, but to know when to bend, when to listen, and when to accept the wisdom of the gods. And so, the story of Okonkwo, the warrior who had fallen, and then risen again, became a legend. A legend not of blood and battle, but of understanding, peace, and the quiet strength that comes from surrendering to the forces greater than oneself. In the end, it was not the strength of the arm that ruled the village, but the strength of the heart. The end. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredible journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more legends, wisdom, and excitement straight from the heart of Africa. Be sure to click the bell icon so you never miss out on our upcoming captivating stories. See you in the next video.